can say before my eternal Father, I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency. The Lord knows I have not hurt him. I am an innocent person. At the end of her trial, on June 28th of 1692, Rebecca Nurse was found not guilty by the jury. The verdict was not surprising, as Nurse was well liked, and 39 people had risked their lives to sign a petition in support of her. When the jury foreman announced the verdict, there was such an outcry that Chief Justice William Stoughton asked the jury to reconsider. Stoughton suggested perhaps they had not heard that Rebecca made an incriminating statement when another prisoner was brought in to testify against her. When questioned as to the meaning of her statement, she would not reply. Rebecca Nurse was 70 years old, frail, and practically deaf, so she probably did not hear the question. The foreman waited briefly, then returned to the jury and soon came back with a new verdict of guilty. This so-called incriminating statement referred to when Nurse called accused witch Goody Hobbs one of us during her trial. Although Nurse didn't respond when questioned about it in court after the trial, she wrote a statement explaining that she only meant Hobbs was a fellow prisoner. On July 3rd, just days after Nurse was convicted, she was taken to the church and publicly excommunicated. 1692, July 3. After sacrament, the elders propounded to the church, and it was by unanimous vote consented to, that our sister Nurse, being a convicted witch by the court and condemned to die, should be excommunicated. On July 19th, 1692, Rebecca Nurse, church member, grandmother, upstanding community member, along with 4 other women, was hanged on Gallows Hill in Salem, Massachusetts. In January of 1692, Reverend Samuel Parris's daughter Elizabeth, age 9, and niece Abigail Williams, age 11, starting having fits. They screamed, threw things, uttered peculiar sounds, and contorted themselves into strange positions. And a local doctor, Dr. William Griggs, blamed bewitchment, which was not all that uncommon for the day when medical profession's somewhat limited understanding of human biology. Another girl, Ann Putnam, age 11, experienced similar episodes. On February 29th, under pressure from local magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Haythorne, the girls blamed 3 women for afflicting them. Tituba, the Parris's Indian slave, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, impoverished woman. All 3 women were brought before the magistrates and interrogated for several days, starting on March 1st, 1692. Osborne claimed innocence, as did Good, but Tituba confessed. The devil came to me and bid me serve him. She said she had seen 2 rats, a red rat and a black rat. She told the magistrates. They said, "Serve me." Tituba confessed to pinching the girls and told the court that she had signed the devil's book after the black man asked her. She admitted that she signed the book and said there were several other witches looking to destroy the Puritans. All 3 women were put in jail. As hysteria spread through the community and beyond into the rest of Massachusetts Bay, a number of others were also accused, including Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse, both regarded as upstanding, covenant members of the church and community. And even the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good was accused. By May 1692, 8 Salem girls had claimed to be enchanted by individuals whom most of them had never met. Several served as visionaries. Relatives of the ailing made pilgrimages to consult with them. They could seemingly explain how several head of cattle had frozen to death several communities away, years earlier. In the courtroom, they provided prophetic direction, cautioning that a suspect would soon kill a child or cause a woman to levitate. With their help, at least 60 witches had been jailed by the end of the month, more than Massachusetts prisons had ever accommodated. Like Tituba, several accused witches confessed and named still others, and the trials soon began to overwhelm the local justice system. On May 27, 1692, Governor William Phips, recently back from England solidifying a new charter for Massachusetts, visited Salem alongside Minister Increase Mather. He was concerned with the chaos witnessed, and he ordered the establishment of a special court of Oyer and Terminer to hear and to decide, established for Suffolk, Essex, and Middlesex counties. This was meant to be an orderly examination of the accused. The court met in June and sentenced the first witch to hang on the 10th, Bridget Bishop, an older woman known for her gossipy habits and promiscuity. When asked if she committed witchcraft, Bishop responded, "I am innocent as the child unborn." After the presentation of spectral evidence by the afflicted girls, or spiritual projections of herself used to harm others, Bishop was found guilty, and on June 10th became the first person hanged on what was later called Gallows Hill. The court recognized that they needed a bit of guidance in these matters. During the next 5 days, 12 ministers conferred. Reverend Cotton Mather, an expert and author in bewitchment, drafted their reply, a circumspect, 8-paragraph document delivered mid-month. Acknowledging the enormity of the crisis, he issued praise to good government. He urged what he called exquisite caution. He warned of the dangers posed to those formerly of an unblemished reputation. In the lines that surely received the greatest scrutiny, Mather reminded the justices that convictions should not rest purely on spectral evidence, which is evidence visibly only to the enchanted who conversed with the devil or its confederates. Mather would insist on this point throughout the summer. Other considerations must weigh against the suspected witch, inasmuch as 'tis an undoubted and notorious thing that a devil might impersonate an innocent, even virtuous man. Mather wondered whether the entire calamity might be resolved if the court discounted those testimonies, but with one sweeping word. Nevertheless. A word that figured in every single official statement Mather made on witchcraft in 1692. He then executed an about-face, having advised exquisite caution, but he also endorsed a speedy and vigorous prosecution. All verbiage that was stoking the flames of hysteria even further. The court largely ignored the request for caution, and 5 people were sentenced and hanged in July, including Rebecca Nurse on July 19th. 5 more were hanged in August, and 8 in September. On October 3rd, echoing and in some ways superseding his son's original statement, Increase Mather, then president of Harvard, denounced the use of spectral evidence. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person be condemned. Governor Phipps, in response to the senior Mather's plea, and more likely because his own wife was being questioned for witchcraft, prohibited further arrests. He released many accused witches and dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29th. Phipps replaced it with a superior court of judicature, which disallowed all spectral evidence but still condemned 3 out of the 56 remaining defendants. Phipps had eventually pardoned all those who were in prison on witchcraft charges by May 1693. But the damage had been done. 19 were hanged on Gallows Hill, plus a 71-year-old man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones. Several people died in jail, and nearly 200 people overall have been accused of practicing the devil's magic. Following the trials and executions, few involved, like Samuel Sewall, publicly confessed error and guilt. On January 14th, 1697, the General Court ordered a day of fasting and soul-searching for the tragedy at Salem. In 1702, the court declared the trials unlawful. And in 1706, Ann Putnam, one of the original chief accusers during the hysteria, applied for a full membership covenant in the Salem church and was required to confess all her earthly sins. She confessed that she acted untruthfully and caused the death of innocent people. She did, however, still blame the devil as the real culprit. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of those accused and granted £600 restitution to their heir. However, it wasn't until 1957, more than 250 years later, that Massachusetts formally apologized for the events of 1692. Now, most likely you've heard much, if not all, of that story before, and it's likely you've already come to some conclusion as to what really happened. What was wrong with those girls? How could it have been allowed to go so far? Why didn't anybody just stop it? Obviously, the girls were faking. Specters aren't real. People have rights. You can't just convict people of witchcraft without any evidence, right? After all, we were there. There's no way we would allow such a thing to happen. Well, remember that we always have to look at history with some type of context. All things good, bad, and other happen for reasons. Let's try to look at a little history and context. Puritans were members of a religious reform movement known as Puritanism that arose within the Church of England in the late 16th century. They believed the Church of England was too similar to the Roman Catholic Church and should eliminate ceremonies and practices not rooted in the Bible. It called for moral reformation and strict discipline. Members had to sign a pledge of faith called a covenant. Access to sacraments like communion were limited to covenant members. Religion was more important to Puritan society than work. The only true respite from work was observed on Sabbath day. On Sundays, Puritans spent their day attending church and in prayer. To do anything else was sinful, and observation of this day or prayer was strictly enforced. On Thursdays, Salem Puritans attended a midweek prayer. For Puritans, holiness was a matter of the soul and evidence of predestination. They understood God predetermined a person to heaven or hell from the moment of creation. They believed those whom God had chosen for heaven could be identified by their piousness and holy deeds and lifestyles. Puritans expressed piousness by attending church, praying frequently, behaving in a frugal manner, and exhibiting a stellar work ethic. These things all constituted good behavior. Puritans imagined good behavior indicated an afterlife in heaven, and many tried to emulate this behavior, hoping it would earn them a place amongst God's elected. Children in particular were told stories of hellfire and eternal punishment as a result of sinful behavior. They were scared into abiding by doctrines and rules. They were made aware they could die at any time and be thrust into hell or heaven depending on their behavior. Girls were held to an even higher standard, as any minuscule transgression on their behalf could be used to deem them as unworthy of salvation. Common tactics used to ensure that people conformed included inspired fear, humiliation, and shame. This led to children usually experiencing considerable anxiety. Puritans viewed outsiders as suspicious. People who held different beliefs, creeds, or did things differently were considered dangerous or evil. Because Puritans believed the community shared the consequences of right and wrong, often community actions were taken to atone for the misdeed. As such, they didn't hesitate to punish or assault people who they deemed to be transgressors against them and against God's will. We have to understand that Puritans living 300 years ago, they didn't have the same reality that we have today. They lived in an enchanted universe, and theirs was a world of wonder. And the term wonder to the colonists were events betoken the presence of superhuman or supernatural forces. Ghosts and spirits were ever present. Magic was real. The devil and his minions could be anywhere at any time. A wonder could also be something unexpected or extraordinary, like a sudden death or a freak coincidence. The Puritan belief in witchcraft evolved over the years from its roots in European culture that predated the founding of the religion itself. And because the Puritans accepted the existence of the devil, they also believed in the possibility of witchcraft. Witchcraft in Puritan society was often a hallmark of a covenant with the devil, either intentional or unintentional. People could unintentionally attract devilish influence by performing little sorceries, like fortune-telling, or over-the-counter magic acts, which were said to attract the devil. Puritans mostly believed those who practiced witchcraft pledged themselves to the devil in order to commit misdeeds. Witches supposedly could act through animals, puppets, and specters. Maleficium was given to witches in return for allegiance to the devil. It was the power to work evil magic. Puppets were doll-like trinkets that were believed to allow witches to enact dark magic on specific individuals in order to commit hellish acts. Additionally, even positive acts such as healing the sick were grounds for witchcraft accusations. On principle, all Native American people were subject to accusations of devil worship, as they were viewed as godless and pagan, and therefore easily influenced by the devil. In fact, due to frequent Native American attacks on other New England towns as a result of the brutal King William's War, Native Americans fell under even deeper suspicion amongst the Puritans. Now let's look at local politics a little bit. In 1684, England revoked the charters or government deeds of the New England colonies, taking away the colonies' form of self-rule. 4 years later, a British officer, Sir Edmund Andros, was appointed as a governor. Now, this effectively nullified all former land titles, taking away legal claims to some properties and plunging the region into chaos. Angry colonists rebelled and overthrew Andros's government in 1689 Boston Revolt. The Massachusetts Charter was restored in 1691, uniting Massachusetts Bay Colony with Plymouth and Maine. Yet the political struggle had put great stress on the Puritans. All this struggle was often pinned on God's unhappiness with the colonists. The 600 Salem residents lived in two distinctly different communities, Salem Town and Salem Village. The town was located closer to the Atlantic coast and had become a bustling urban commercial center with many affluent citizens. In contrast, the village was an isolated agriculture hamlet, the scattering of houses and farms, many of which were owned by just a handful of families. They're sort of the breadbasket for Salem Town. In the winter, residents had to walk up to 2 hours just to go from one side of the village to the other side to town because of the wilderness and harsh weather conditions. Salem villagers were mostly farmers and servants who adhered to more traditional religious and social values than the town residents. One of the pivotal points here was the halfway covenant. To find a way to integrate children of fully covenant members into the church community, the halfway covenant was adopted, which was a religious political compromise presented in 1662 that allowed children of baptized but unconverted church members to be baptized and thus become church members and have political rights. And to be in a covenant with a church in covenant theology was to say that God had accepted the person as a member of the church and thus included the person in the great agreement with God. Now, this halfway covenant compromise caused much strife because it seemingly allowed some Salem Village churchgoers a sort of shortcut to full church membership via Salem Town's policies. Although Salem Town had political and religious authority over Salem Village, about half of the villagers felt they should rule themselves, not to mention commuting a couple hours every week to the church across town. Preacher Samuel Parris, a newcomer to the area, was the controversial leader of a group that wanted independence from Salem town. The villagers who favored self-rule gathered around Parris and his close friends, the Putnams, who owned most of the farming land in Salem village. In 1689, Parris was hired by the Putnam family to take over the congregation and form a new church, which consisted mainly of the Putnams and their relatives, that was separate from the one in town. Parris had been a failed businessman and saw this new position as a way to gain the power and prestige he always sought. Normally, a town minister would receive a modest salary, the use of a house, and free firewood as payment for his services. Parris got all these benefits in addition to title and deed to the parish, the area where the congregation members live, that surrounded his land. This deal angered the residents who didn't want separate churches for villages and town. Through his sermons, Parris attacked the motives of his opposition and those who disagreed with him, and over the next couple of years portrayed those motives as demonic. Many involved in the idealistic division in the town saw Parris as an unnecessary drain on meager resources. They rebelled by not paying their local taxes, which paid Parris's salary, and refusing to worship in the Salem Village meeting house. As a result, Parris would have to sustain himself and his family solely off voluntary contributions. But this wasn't the first time that the congregation withheld their taxes and earned a minister's salary. George Burroughs was previously minister beginning in 1680. A forceful personality, Burroughs had completed the education of a minister but never been ordained. During his career as an unordained preacher, he offended many Puritan leaders by overstepping his authority, particularly during his years in the outlying settlements of Maine. After a time of not being paid, Burroughs borrowed money from the wealthy Putnam family. By March of 1683, Burroughs simply stopped meeting his congregation and then accepted an offer to resume his ministerial duties at Casco Bay, which had been reorganized after an Indian attack. After yet another attack in 1690, he relocated to Wells, Maine. In May of 1692, during the Salem witch trials, based on the accusations of the Putnams, who had sued him for the previous debt, Burroughs was charged, arrested, and brought back to Salem. Among other offenses, he was accused of extraordinary strength, which could not have been achieved without diabolical assistance. His notable dark hair and complexion only added to the people's suspicions that he might have non-Puritan connections, either spiritual or social. Massachusetts ministers and judges were ready to believe the worst of a man who moved freely between the wilderness frontier and more settled areas, and who somehow escaped Indian attacks on more than one occasion. Now let's dig into these Indian attacks and nearby wars a little bit more, because knowing some of the history, trauma, and emotions these people were experiencing is key to understanding why and how this hysteria manifested. By the mid-1600s, English settlers had set up a number of small but flourishing trading outposts, which had grown into small communities in places between Casco Bay and Kittery, as well as modern-day Durham and Berwick. However, many Native American communities also existed in Maine and had lived there long before the English settlers had arrived. The Wabanaki had grown reliant on the trade that the English and French settlers had brought into their communities. Although there were tensions between the differing cultural groups, war would not probably have broken out. However, when King Philip's War began in Massachusetts in 1675 between indigenous inhabitants of the New England area, as well as the New England colonists and their indigenous allies, the Wabanaki tribes in Maine were eventually pulled into the conflict. Violent attacks on Anglo settlements and forts would continue until 1677. Mercy Lewis, Susanna Sheldon, Abigail Hobbs, and Reverend George Burroughs, individuals who figured in the accusations of the trial, had lived in Maine. In 1692, Abigail Hobbs confessed to being a witch while being questioned in a Salem meeting house. She said that the devil recruited her in the woods outside her home 4 years earlier, which was in Falmouth, Maine. She then said the devil had made her afflict others, and she had done so. She attacked Ann Putnam and Mercy Lewis. The next day, Ann Putnam, one of the more famous figures from the incident, then accused Reverend George Burroughs of being a witch too. Now this is all related to the Maine and the wars, because Lewis, Sheldon, Hobbs, and Burroughs, along with many others, fled the frontier, which was then Casco Bay, during the violent Indian Wars. They were all witnesses to these terrible atrocities. The girls were all small children when they saw dismemberments, scalpings. Mercy Lewis was orphaned during these attacks, and her and Burroughs escaped down to Salem. This could have a profound effect on their behavior and mental states, not to mention the puritanical view that events like this could be acts of God released to punish them, the wicked. Now let's look a little bit at the court. The legal system at the time was set up to try to find truth over defense. The accused rarely had a professional assistance, and innocent until proven guilty was not applicable at this time. The court hearings for accused witches broadly applied principles practiced in Europe and colonial courts at the time, except for one crucial difference. English courts had 20 years earlier rejected testimony based on spectral evidence, which is the claim by afflicted persons that they could see a witch's or demon's specter emanating from the body of the accused. The European courts had rejected that evidence not because they didn't believe in specters, but because there was no way to tell if it was actually the specter of the accused or a trick of the devil. Those involved in the legal proceedings in Salem used reference manuals describing the activities of alleged witches and recounting various witchcraft trials throughout history. One such book was Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486. It served as a handbook for investigating and prosecuting witches. It consisted of examinations of the accused, which was a line of questioning to try and convince a witch to confess. Physical signs of witchcraft, such as witches' teeth, where demonic creatures or familiars could feed off the bewitched, were also considered. It may sound like it, but it was not a kangaroo court. For those times, it was an unusual legal system, and the interweaving of legal and religious beliefs seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. We view these events and wonder how they continued. But it's not like similar hysteria events haven't occurred in modern times. In the 20th century, artists and scientists alike continued to be fascinated by the Salem witch trials. Playwright Arthur Miller resurrected the tale with his 1953 play The Crucible, using the trials as an allegory for the McCarthyism paranoia in the 1950s. Similar paranoia hit in the 70s and 80s in a couple of examples, including when people began accusing daycares all over the country with unfounded crimes and abuses. Hand in hand with that is the satanic panic, hysteria of the early 80s. Prejudice, injustice, and intolerance are in everybody's mind now. The trials were driven by fear, harsh weather, disease, supply shortages, war, trauma, which altogether created the conditions for invented crimes and persecution for no good reason. The Salem witch trials stand as a warning that justice may always be miscarried when authorities become determined to persecute nonconformists or political enemies. Playwright Arthur Miller stated in an interview about the trials, quote, "They come, these surges of intolerance, usually when there is a social dislocation, when a society is sick and it's run out of solutions, and it doesn't know where to look. That's when the demagogue can get up and start evoking vague dangers from vague corners." That's just a little bit of the story. If you're interested in learning more, I'll include links to my references down below. I hope you enjoyed this little peek at history. Like and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts on the trials, and if there's anything else that you want to learn about.